Hello Year 12, it's Mr. Godman here and I'm going to be taking your lesson today, and we're going to start our new topic, which is all about Lenin and the Civil War. And we'll begin today with our lesson on were the Bolsheviks destined to become dictators? So it should be really exciting. I'd like you to get yourself ready for the lesson with everything that you need. You'll need the worksheets that I've sent you. You'll need a pen. You will need some A4 paper because you're going to be taking some notes. And if you have any distractions like phones and things like that, I would ask you to pop those away so that you can really focus on the lesson. If you need to, pause now, get yourself ready, and then press play when you're ready to go. Okay, so it's been a while since we looked at Russia, and the last lesson that you did for me was all about the Bolsheviks' seizure of power in October of 1917. So I'm giving you a quick knowledge recall quiz here with 5 questions that I'd like you to have a go at. They're all short answers, and I'd like you to try and do this, please, without looking back at any of your notes, without looking back at your previous work, and we're trying to improve your memories here. So pause the video, have a go, and when you're totally finished, hit play and we'll look at the answers. Okay, and here are the answers to those questions. I'd like you to mark your own work, preferably in a different colour pen. If you get one wrong, don't panic, but I do want you to make a correction to your work, and when you're finished, don't forget to add up your score out of 5. Pause now, mark your answers, and when you're ready to move on, hit play again. So we're starting a new topic today and a new file divider, and our new topic is the Civil War and Lenin between 1917 and 1924. I'm going to give you something different for this topic. It's called a knowledge organiser, and what I've tried to do here is set down just on one page all the main key details, key events, key people, key words that you need to know in this topic. And these are the things that I'm really going to test your factual recall of. Now it looks quite complicated and quite detailed because it is an A-level knowledge organiser, but hopefully it's going to make it a little bit easier for you to follow and build up your knowledge as we go through the unit. So you'll need this every lesson. So I've highlighted here all the bits of the knowledge organiser which we're going to start to touch on in today's lesson, and I'd like you to keep your own copy of the knowledge organiser and highlight your copy as well so that you can see which bits of content we've covered. If you need to pause now and do that, then do so and hit play when you're ready to move forward. So today's lesson is, were the Bolsheviks destined to become dictators? We're going to start by looking at some of the problems facing the Bolsheviks after they took power in October of 1917. I want you to know the key features of the authoritarian dictatorship which the Bolsheviks set up in 1917 to 1924. And we're going to do some analysis on whether the dictatorship was inherently part of Bolshevik ideology. So here is your starter task, Year 12. And I want you to think here about the situation which the Bolsheviks were in when they first took power at the end of October 1917. So I've given you 2 sources. One comes from a Petrograd newspaper and the other comes from a soldier who belonged to the SRs. My question to you is this: what do these 2 sources reveal about the Bolsheviks' position after they seized power at the end of October 1917. You're going to need to read the sources really carefully, and I'd like you to pause the video and to note down all your ideas. And when you've had a really good think about it and you're finished, then hit play again and I'll share with you some of my ideas about this. Okay, so let's look at some possible answers here. These two sources were really interesting, weren't they? Because they painted quite a bleak picture of the situation which the Bolsheviks found themselves in after taking power. They make clear that the Bolsheviks lacked popular support when they seized power at the end of October. They didn't appear to have much public backing. And they suggest that there were some really severe problems facing the Bolsheviks. There were food shortages in the towns, and civil servants in the different government departments or ministries were making it very difficult for the Bolsheviks to rule by refusing to cooperate with them. The second source says that the ministries had gone on strike, making it very difficult for the Bolsheviks to govern. The sources also suggest that Bolshevik support among the Petrograd garrison was limited, and the garrison were not united in support of the Bolshevik takeover. Taken together, both these sources seem to suggest that the Bolsheviks were not expected to stay in power for long, that they were expected to last just a few weeks before being swept aside and forgotten about. And that actually reveals one of the reasons why the Bolsheviks in the end survived. Their opponents underestimated them. They believed that the Bolsheviks were here today and would be gone tomorrow. They underestimated what the Bolsheviks were capable of and what the Bolsheviks would do, the lengths they would go to actually hold on to power. Let's develop this a little further by thinking about the situation in October of 1917 when the Bolsheviks first took power. Now, up until that point, the Bolsheviks had been a party of revolutionaries. They had spent their time preparing for revolution. They had put incredible thought into how they were going to achieve a revolution in Russia. But they'd given almost no thought whatsoever to what they would actually do after taking power. And Lenin remarked that from being on the run to supreme power makes one feel dizzy. Now, right from the beginning, the Bolsheviks were engaged in a desperate struggle for survival. And as we've seen, nobody really expected Bolshevik government to survive. There was good reason to believe that the Bolsheviks would not last for very long. The civil servants in Petrograd went on strike, and they literally refused to work for the Bolshevik government. The state bank, which was the source of finance for the government, they refused to hand over any money to the Bolsheviks. And outside of Petrograd, and a little later Moscow, many Soviets were controlled by non-Bolsheviks, so Mensheviks, SRs, even non-socialist parties. And even Soviets with Bolshevik majorities often defied instructions. So actually, outside of the two main cities, the Bolsheviks had almost no control over the vast majority of the country. And probably the biggest problem they faced was that the war was continuing, and we've seen before how significant that problem was for the provisional government and for the Tsar before them. The Bolsheviks inherit that same problem. The war is causing huge chaos in Russia. Shortages of raw materials, inflation is out of control, the transport network is collapsing, there are grain shortages and widespread hunger in many parts of the country. These problems, and ultimately the war was the root cause of them, these problems have brought down the provisional government, and they'd helped to bring down the Tsar before that. So for many people, they expected the Bolsheviks to be brought down in exactly the same way. And what I'd like you to do at this point of the lesson is to pause the video, and I want you just to summarise in your own words, in your notes, briefly, why the Bolsheviks' opponents did not expect them to last very long in power. I'm probably just going to write maybe a paragraph on this, but no more than that. When you're done, hit play and we'll move forward. So the topic that we're going to start today is called Lenin and the Civil War, 1917 to 1924. You can see that I've put up an overview of this particular topic, and we're going to divide it into three sections. The Bolsheviks' first months in power, then the Civil War itself, from roughly 1918 to 1921, and finally Lenin's last years between 1921 and 1924. And I've put up some of the key events as well that we're going to touch on and cover in those particular parts of the course. Now this is a really exciting and interesting part of the course. Some historians have suggested that what Russia went through in this period is pretty much comparable to the Black Death in 14th century Europe, that Russia went through a crisis of huge proportions. There was a bitter civil war. The country was invaded by several foreign armies. It suffered a terrible famine. The transport network virtually collapsed. The cities suffered near starvation, and the urban population fell by about a third as people left the cities and headed to the countryside to find food. In total, 10 million Russians died. So this is a period of intense crisis. And yet, against all expectations, the Bolshevik government survived. And by 1924, not only had they survived, but they had set up an authoritarian dictatorship in Russia. And as we work through this part of our course, there are two big questions that we're going to keep coming back to again and again and again. The first one is this: how and why did the Bolsheviks manage to survive and consolidate their grip on power? How did they achieve that? And the second big question that we're going to keep coming back to is this one: why did the Bolsheviks become dictators? What caused that to happen? So by the time that we finish this topic, we will have seen that the Bolsheviks created an authoritarian dictatorship in Russia. So it's useful for us to define what the key features of that dictatorship were. Firstly, by 1924, the Bolsheviks have established a one-party state in which only the Communist Party, and the Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communist Party, only the Communist Party was permitted. All other parties are banned and their views are censored. The Bolsheviks also set up a very centralised state. Now, as a general rule of thumb, centralisation means when more and more power is exercised in the hands of a very small number of people. Now, the Bolsheviks set up a centralised state, and that has three aspects that we'll see. Firstly, the central government acquires really extensive control politically and economically over the entire country. The second aspect is that the Communist Party comes to dominate the government at all levels. And thirdly, the Communist Party itself becomes highly centralised, with a small number of leaders exercising huge power over the decisions. The Communist Party also becomes increasingly bureaucratic and undemocratic. And what this means is the party becomes full of unelected officials who carry out orders rather than a party full of members who are able to elect their leaders and shape party policy. It becomes a party full of bureaucrats carrying out instructions given by the party leadership. The third aspect of this dictatorship is the use of force and coercion. We'll see that the Bolsheviks set up institutions which they use to arrest, torture and execute their opponents. They also subject workers and peasants to coercion. Factory workers are strictly disciplined in their factories, and the peasants' grain is taken by force. The last feature of this dictatorship regards the army, and the Bolsheviks initiate really strict discipline within the army. They impose a very hierarchical system in the army and strict discipline on the soldiers themselves, and we'll see that develop. Now we're going to come back to these features of dictatorship over the coming lessons, and we're going to look really carefully and closely at when they develop and how they develop. So this has to be something that we keep right at the front of our minds. So I'm actually going to ask you to pause now, and I want you to make your own copy of this diagram. If you need to, you can put it into your own words or you could annotate it. But I want you to make a copy of your own, and you're going to need to keep this handy throughout this particular unit of work. Now if you need to go back and listen to me explain those features again, then do so, but when you're ready to make your copy, pause the video, and when you're finished, hit play and we'll move forward. So today's lesson is all about, were the Bolsheviks destined for dictatorship? And we're going to start to think already about that second big question. Why did the Bolsheviks become dictators? Now, I'm going to offer you two possible hypotheses or theories on this. Here's hypothesis number one. The Bolsheviks always intended to set up an authoritarian dictatorship. They planned it from day one, and it was always part of their ideology. The second hypothesis I'm going to offer you is this one. The Bolsheviks didn't plan to set up an authoritarian dictatorship. They never intended to do this. It was an unintended response to an unexpected crisis which they found themselves in, the Civil War. Now, by the end of the unit, you're going to come to a decision about which of these hypotheses you think is correct. Or maybe you can come up with a better hypothesis of your own to fit the evidence which we're going to uncover. So you're ready for your first main task now, and I've given you a little set of sources to read. Some of them come from the writings of Lenin, and some of them come from the words of other leading Bolsheviks. The last two sources come from historians. Now I want you to read the sources really carefully. They're very revealing about the nature and character of the Bolsheviks and their ideology. And I want you to think about whether these sources show that the Bolsheviks were destined to create a dictatorship. So you're going to annotate or highlight the sources in two colours, looking for evidence to support our two hypotheses. So in one colour, I'd like you to identify any evidence that you can find to support hypothesis 1, that the Bolsheviks always intended to set up a dictatorship, that it was part of their ideology, that it was in their DNA. In another colour, I'd like you to highlight any evidence to support hypothesis 2, that the Bolsheviks did not plan to set up an authoritarian dictatorship. Maybe it was not their ideology to be dictators. And when you're done annotating the sources, then I want you to hit play again, and we're going to look at the sources together. So pause now, do the activity, and hit play when you're ready to move on. So hopefully you've had a chance to look at the sources for yourself, and now I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts about them. Source A was one of Lenin's earlier writings. He's writing here in the early days of the Bolshevik Party, and as you can see, I've put a couple of the phrases in bold because I think they're really key here. Lenin's setting out his vision of what the party should be like. And instantly we can see here that the party from its earliest days was very centralised and undemocratic. The leaders made the decisions and the members simply had to follow them. And we can also see here that right from the party's earliest days, it was unwilling to compromise or work with other parties. So again, perhaps we can see some roots there of the Bolsheviks' undemocratic tendencies. However, we have got to be a little bit cautious with this source. Lenin here is describing how a party should operate in 1902. And remember, at that point, the Bolsheviks were having to exist undercover, hidden from the Tsarist secret police. So perhaps this is a good guide to Lenin's view of how the party should operate during the Tsarist autocracy. It's not necessarily a good source for giving us a longer term view of how Lenin envisaged the party working after the Tsar was removed. So we need to be a little bit cautious about this source. Now, the second source that you had is one of Lenin's later writings. And this source is really interesting because it's Lenin talking about how a socialist revolution will happen and how socialist revolution will spread worldwide. Now, there's something really important here in what Lenin says. He believes that international war between countries will turn into civil wars within countries, and that this is a necessary thing which has to happen in order for socialist revolution to take place. In other words, Lenin is effectively saying here that civil war is desirable. It's not an unintended accident. Lenin is telling us here that civil war is a necessary condition for socialist revolution. And that really challenges hypothesis 2. Lenin's saying here that civil war isn't accidental, that he actually views it as a desirable thing. He wants civil war because that's how socialist revolution is going to take place. Source C is another of Lenin's later works, which he completed very shortly before the takeover of power. Now, there's quite a lot in this one which is really interesting, and I've put quite a few phrases there in bold. Let's think about what Lenin is saying here. He's effectively arguing that after a socialist revolution, when the country is turned socialist, there would be no need for a strong state or a strong government, as the people themselves would run their affairs democratically. This seems to suggest that Lenin's long-term plan is not a dictatorship. It's a superior form of democracy in which the people self-govern. Now that challenges hypothesis 1, doesn't it? It suggests that Lenin's long-term goal was not a dictatorship. But in the second section there, Lenin makes it clear that he believes a temporary period of dictatorship would be necessary first, and that he's planning for that. And he calls it the dictatorship of the proletariat. And he's drawing on Marx's theory there. And he states very clearly that in that period of dictatorship, the party will need to use force and coercion to eliminate their class enemies. So we have evidence there that Lenin intended to set up a one-party dictatorship based on the use of force, at least for a period of time. Source D is another of Lenin's later works. Can the Bolsheviks retain state power? Was the name of this article that he wrote. A couple of things really interesting in here that I've highlighted for you, but the key conclusion from this is that Lenin rules out very clearly here entering into any kind of coalition with any other party. He's not willing to work with any other party here. He sees this as a betrayal of the proletariat. So maybe this suggests that Lenin intended to create a one-party state. The last contemporary source that I gave you came from a statement by Kamenev, Zinoviev and others. And you'll hopefully remember from our work previously that Kamenev and Zinoviev were two leading Bolsheviks who opposed the seizure of power. And this statement that they made is really quite interesting because it makes clear that even though Lenin might have been opposed to the idea of coalition with other parties, not all Bolsheviks shared that view. And some Bolsheviks, including Kamenev and Zinoviev, wanted to work with other socialist parties. So perhaps not all Bolsheviks intended to create a one-party state. Some Bolsheviks wanted to work with the other socialist parties. And there's a warning here as well. These Bolsheviks clearly understand that unless the Bolsheviks work in coalition with other parties, then they would have to rule based on force. And Kamenev and Zinoviev are suggesting very strongly here that that is not what they want the Bolsheviks to do. So perhaps they're evidence to support hypothesis 2. And now your last couple of sources were a little bit different. They came from historians. So firstly, you had an extract from the historian Darby. And he describes what he believes was the nature and the character of the Bolsheviks in this period. And there are a couple of really important conclusions that he comes to. Firstly, he suggests that the Bolsheviks were driven by a really strong belief in their mission to build socialism. And because their belief was so strong, that led them to believe that anything that the party did was right and their opponents were always wrong. And this was a justification for the Bolsheviks doing things which were extreme and ruthless and brutal and cruel. In fact, he remarks on the Bolsheviks' ruthless streak, and he says that by nature they were ruthless and cruel, and they were prepared to do anything to hang on to power, including using force, even against some of their own people, the workers and the peasants. But in fact, he also argues that the Bolsheviks themselves were undemocratic, that they wanted to impose their views on the people. They saw themselves as teachers, not servants of the people. They wanted to impose their views on the people rather than carrying out the people's instructions. So they were inherently undemocratic. It was part of their ideology, it was part of their belief system. Lastly, you had an extract from Acton, and he's one of the revisionist historians that we were talking about last time. His work's really quite useful and interesting because it's based on revisionist sources, accounts from the Soviet archives, which allow us to understand the beliefs and actions and views of kind of ordinary members of Russian society and lower ranking Bolsheviks, ordinary members, if you will. And he comes to a number of really useful conclusions. Firstly, he suggests that in that last year before the Bolsheviks seized power, between February 1917 and October 1917, the whole reason why the Bolsheviks succeeded was actually because they were highly democratic as a party. And he gives some evidence to support that. He says that the Bolsheviks were incredibly sensitive to public opinion, and that they had a tradition of consultation and debate, party elections, and through these mechanisms the ordinary party members themselves were able to shape policy and influence the party leadership. In other words, this was not an undemocratic party in 1917 when it took power. In fact, it was highly democratic. So that might support hypothesis 2. So your final task today is this. I want you to take a clean page and I want you to set up a table with 2 columns and put our 2 hypotheses at the top of them. And then using the sources we've looked at, I want you to summarise the evidence which we've seen so far to support those 2 hypotheses. Now don't worry if you end up with more in one column than you do in the other. That's absolutely fine. In fact, that might help us to make our decision at the end. So don't worry if you've got more evidence to support one hypothesis than the other. That's perfectly okay. You can see I've put an example piece of evidence for hypothesis 1 there, just to give you a model of the kind of summary which I want you to do. And when you're done on this table, I really want you to keep it safe because we're going to be building on it as we go through this unit. So you need to keep this to hand. And when you've done that, we're finished on this lesson. So well done, Year 12. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where there are a few other A-level videos available and more will be posted. And if you subscribe, you'll always be the first to know when a new video gets published. And I'll look forward to teaching you again a little later this week in our next lesson.